descent. Oh, and just like the river.
I think justice, maybe what I liked about Abraham Lincoln was the matter of rooting for justice. Anyway, now fast forward to the 1960s, things were anything but just, and things started exploding in the mid 1960s with the riots in the streets, main cities all across this country.
It's been too hard living, but I'm afraid to die.
Almost 100 years after President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, African Americans in the United States still did not enjoy legal or social equality. On the contrary, blacks were regularly oppressed by disenfranchisement, segregation, violence. Racist Jim Crow laws prevented them from accessing bathrooms, classrooms, and legislatures. Even in 1954, when the U.S. Supreme Court nullified the separate but equal doctrine that served as a justification for segregation, blacks had to fight to truly obtain their long-deserved rights.
Do you recall a certain age at which you feel like, okay, we've crossed that landmark, we've shifted to a point where we're really starting to pick up speed, or was it just always very gradual and it felt just like kind of taking its time, integration?
I think it's always gradual, and if there's a time you're noticing, just like the expression "the straw that broke the camel's back," it's like the millionth straw. It's breaking the camel's back, not a straw. Or you're filling up a glass drop by drop with water, and at some point, the last drop will make it overflow. Well, anything that happens that might seem like a landmark was preceded by how many hundreds, thousands of other things, on a big scale, on a small scale. Well, Rosa Parks, for example, very well known for sitting on the front seat of the bus. She wasn't the first black person to sit in the front seat of the bus. Many people had sat on the front seat of the bus, and of course they got kicked to the back. But a lot of what they were trying to do at the time was turn social issues into litigation, into like laws and things. And you had to have someone who was beyond reproach. If you have someone who's just gotten out of jail and now he's sitting on the front seat of the bus, well, you can't, then people say, well, he's just like, a thug or something, or never obeys the law. But if you have this nice woman who's never done anyone any harm, and there's not a single bad thing you can say about her, and she's just tired from a day's work, and she's sitting on the front of the bus, well, it's a clear case of discrimination. So many things were like that. I think nothing ever happened suddenly. Everything was preceded by a million other things.
Just as whites were persistent and even innovative in their retention of power over blacks, blacks had to be relentless in their fight to overcome societal injustice and oppression. Often, change only happened as a result of the efforts of countless individuals, all of whom contributed until the tipping point was reached. Rosa Parks was one of the most famous examples of this phenomenon, but there were many others who served as the straw that broke the camel's back for different civil rights issues. Certain individuals, particularly leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, were at the forefront of the systematic struggle to bring as many civil rights issues to the nation's attention as possible.
I was a bigger fan in the 60s of Martin Luther King because I really liked his approach to nonviolence. So there was what I would not really even consider, it wasn't really a rivalry between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. It wasn't. They were all working for the same thing, but they had different ideas about how to approach it. And I was sort of more in alignment with Martin Luther King, who kind of aligned himself with Gandhi and the matter of nonviolent resistance. So I learned more about Malcolm X kind of after the fact, after he was assassinated. Again, that was also a shocking thing. He was more controversial, though, at the time than But then when I learned more about him and I read his autobiography, I actually also came to admire him tremendously. And I felt like he'd been really misrepresented to the mass of the people who perhaps, who knows what people's agendas are, but wanted people to think poorly of him, wanted people to be against him. There's always this, rabble-rousing, and it happens today, it happened then too, where you try to find things that will turn people against them. And so there were those that I think maybe were a little afraid of what Malcolm X represented, and so wanted to make him look like, a bad guy. But he was hardly that. He was a very, very sincere person, and I know I had the same experience as my daughter when we read the autobiography of Malcolm X. When it got to the end, now he hadn't died except in the postscript because it's an autobiography, but we were like, oh, we miss Malcolm. So smart, so dedicated, and his ideas evolved over time. But anyway, yeah, he was another really wonderful person.
People get ready, there's a train a-coming. You don't need.
Despite the tremendous progress made during the civil rights movement, racism undoubtedly still exists in the United States. However, the racism of today is different from that of the civil rights era. Sometimes it is blatantly obvious, such as the gratuitous police brutality towards blacks that has come to the nation's attention recently. But more often, today's racism is subtle. The more subtle racism of today exists in various forms, from the innumerable small demonstrations of distrust or anger that blacks receive from whites, to the virtual impossibility of many blacks to break the cycle of poverty due to discriminatory school policies and criminal justice systems that often target areas with predominantly black populations. As far as Americans have come in the battle for racial equality, as passionately as they have rooted for justice in this country, there is still much room for growth.
I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom.
My husband's from Iran. He actually has never really felt like he experienced prejudice. In retrospect, as we look back at things that happened in the past, we could see, maybe there was a little discrimination here or there. But, he's sort of been oblivious in terms of himself, same way I was at Jefferson High School. I mean, there probably was all kinds of things going on, but I was having a great time. So, I was a little oblivious to it. But of course, he's always cared about the issue of civil rights. He's cared about the issue of discrimination. He's in his late 60s now. But when he had a grandson born, who, though he's biracial, the world will see as African American, that changed the passion he feels for the issue of civil rights. Because the idea that his grandson, and we know what will happen because we're not that far along yet, will grow up and be discriminated against and perhaps have a racial slur thrown at them. It will happen because we're not that far along yet. My husband cannot stand, he is so passionate, the idea that how unfair is this? Here's this child, born in brown skin. He's just a person. But people will look at the skin first. And so, the passion he has for the issue of civil rights now is different than the intellectual agreement he had with it 10 years ago, or 12 or 15 years ago. So I think people have to feel a passion for justice, not just an intellectual agreement with justice.